Hello everyone, so today we're going to be looking at a presentation about something that we've been leading up to for a long time, the Civil War. We've talked about the causes, we've talked about the antebellum era, everything leading up to this point. Now this is of course a very important topic in American history, but it's something where we need to focus on all the different aspects going on in it. A lot of times when people study the Civil War, they want to study the military aspects only. That's what a lot of people who really enjoy the Civil War are into. That's not what the College Board is into, so if that's what you're looking for, you'll need to look elsewhere. Alright, here we go. So, first thing we need to talk about is the beginning of the war and basically how it was fought. How both the Union, the North, the Confederacy, the South, were mobilizing their economies, their societies to enact total war. So this is a term that you do need to know. It's just the idea that all national resources, labor, land, capital, should be directed toward the war effort instead of private enterprises for personal profit. Okay, this is going to happen during the Civil War. We're going to see it happen during World War I, World War II. All these major nationally declared wars where in order to win, you need all the resources you can. You can't have multiple goals going on at the same time. Now, as implied by the left, what we have going on is both the governments in the Union and the Confederacy are putting out sort of their full efforts here, but home front opposition existed on both sides. So many people in the Union weren't fully on board with the war. Many people in the Confederacy, despite wanting to be their own country, even though they weren't, also didn't really want to fully dedicate themselves to this war either. So each of them wanted, certain goals, but to achieve them, the people themselves weren't as willing to achieve those goals. Now, one thing that each side had was a military draft. So the idea that mostly young men were required to serve in the military. So the Confederacy enacts the draft first, and some states resisted by making laws to oppose it. So something you need to understand about the Confederacy is one thing that they put inside their Article of Secession has to do a lot with anger at the federal government for trying to make laws that were going to limit their ability to make decisions within the states regarding tariffs, regarding slavery, regarding many issues. So you go back to this Confederacy. It's almost kind of like the Articles of Confederation in the early U.S. history, where suddenly the national government isn't as powerful. Or at least the states don't think it should be. So when the national government of the Confederacy says, we're going to have a draft, some states are like, but wait, I thought you were trying to give each of the states more rights than the United States federal government was. So people resisted it, but eventually people do have to serve in that military as well. Both the Confederacy and the Union allowed substitutes to be bought. So what this means is there was this idea that it was the rich man's war being fought by the poor man. Okay, so if you were rich, you could pay a couple $100. If you could find a substitute, you would pay them the money, they'd go and fight, maybe die for you, and you wouldn't have to go off to war. Now, you can see that this sets up kind of a little bit of class warfare. Up to this point, remember, we get the diversification of society. We've now got a large working class, a sizable middle class, especially in the North, and a very small business elite. Those people at the top and the middle class could buy their way out of service, but that left the working class and many immigrants as well basically in this place where they had to fight a war that they didn't necessarily want to fight, that they didn't think it was about them. In New York City, there are draft riots, so a lot of immigrants opposed the war. Many of them were offered the ability to become citizens if they enlisted in the draft willingly. Okay, so you can see there was this incentive to fight, to become a citizen, but you might die in the process. A lot of people started to feel like this was exploiting the poor in order to fight the rich man's war. There's the movie Gangs of New York back from early 2000s, late 1990s, made by Martin Scorsese. It actually has these draft riots in there as it takes place in the Five Points area of New York amidst the Civil War, and kind of shows what society was like and kind of how it was a little scary too. Alright, so realize, military draft is going on, but we're setting up some class conflict over people not so much wanting to serve in the war, but still wanting their side to win. Women's roles had a little bit of change within during the war, but of course baby steps, not as much as many women would want. So, for women, many had to enter the workforce as nurses to serve wounded. Many started working in factories as well, now that most of the men were going to be serving in the war. So, of course, factory workers are the working class. They can't afford to buy substitutes, so they're off to war, but you still need factories to make all the things that are needed to fight the war. So, to make the clothes, so the uniforms, the weapons, everything that goes along with it. Okay? Realize this manufacturing is mostly in the north because, think about it for a second, back to the market revolution. They had the infrastructure that the South did not, and the South is going to struggle with manufacturing because they did not have that, and now they, as envisioning themselves as their own country, can't rely on the North for manufactured goods anymore. Speaking of which, let's look at available resources during the war. The Union controlled 2/3 of the population, so most people lived in states that remained in the Union. They controlled 2/3 of the railroad, so transportation, and also 90% of industry. So the Confederacy is going to have to try to rely on buying foreign goods because they can't trade with the North anymore. What this gives the North is a significant advantage for all the things you need to fight a war. And at first, the Confederacy is going to be somewhat successful, but as the war drags on, this instance that we see right here in dealing with infrastructure and industry is going to cripple the Confederacy and kind of doom them to defeat. Remember, Confederacy was still mostly agricultural. They have the economic wealth of the U.S., so basically the Union struggling to have a source of natural resources now, but they have all the manufacturing so they can get the resources from elsewhere still. More expensive, but all the same, they still have the ability to make what they need to fight the war. The Confederacy didn't have the other side of the coin now. Okay, policies that each side enacted. The Union, because the South is gone now, enacts high tariffs. Now, this is a really important idea. So, during the Civil War, the way the Union views the Confederacy is they are not their own country. They are states in rebellion, which basically means that representatives from those states for the federal Congress are just not showing up to vote. So what happens is it becomes that there's Northern Democrats in a minority and a majority of Republicans from northern and western states. So what they do is they start enacting all the policies that the South and the Southern Democrats had been blocking for decades. So among that, high tariffs, and then selling government bonds. Government bonds are the idea that you take your savings and you buy government bonds. They use the money for what they need, and of course, if they win the war, they will pay you back the money with a little bit of interest. On the Confederate side, they didn't increase taxes. Remember, the Confederacy is much like the Articles of Confederation in that they didn't think the national government should be able to tax the states. That was a state issue. But what that leads to is the same problem of the Articles of Confederation. There was not as much money to pay for national expenditures. And what they do is a rookie mistake. Have me talk about it more in class during our question session in case I haven't mentioned it before, but they just started printing more paper money, and this leads to inflation. This is economics, and it's a little complicated, so ask me about it in class, and we'll definitely go over it then during our time. Now what happens is when the policies don't work for the Confederacy, they start to say the policies that go along with our country as they envisioned it aren't going to work. So what they did is, because they didn't want to seem like they were doing the same things the federal government was doing before, they start playing on the fear of Southerners of what a Union victory could mean for the repeal of slavery. And that kind of gets the Confederates in line, more people joining the military draft willingly, people willing to pay extra taxes, people getting in line so that they don't lose and then sort of have to face the consequences of a victorious Union, which of course happens anyway. Alright, so next up, talking about some of the early military history, but also as we get on with the war, we need to talk about how the goals of the war shifted, especially for the Union. Okay, that's a really important idea. Now, early in the war, the Confederacy was dominating the battles because they had military superiority and better leadership. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Earlier, before the Civil War, the military was a federal national institution. So that meant that you had this military that represented the whole country, where people were coming from all states all over the country to represent one country. But now that we're split, it became apparent that most of the military leadership that was seasoned in battle and had better strategy, they were all from southern states that were seceding. So they decided to stay with the Confederacy rather than stay with the national government, with the Union. Among them was Robert E. Lee, pictured on the upper right there. Now, interesting with him, he was from Virginia, but from his plantation and his home, the property that was his home is today Arlington National Cemetery. And if anyone's been to D.C. and been to Arlington, you see his house up on the hill there. It's got a beautiful view of Washington, D.C. And he was in this weird position where he had to decide, was he going to stay with his state or stay with his country? He ultimately chose Virginia and then was pretty much the main general for the Confederacy. So, Confederacy had early victories. First Battle of Bull Run, the South calls that the First Battle of Manassas, and it demonstrated they had better strategy. Moving on, essentially what happens is each side wanted to try to make the war occur on the other person's turf. Okay, the Union was trying to move towards Richmond, Virginia, which was the second capital of the Confederacy. The first was Montgomery, all the way down in Alabama. They moved up north once Virginia seceded. Meanwhile, the Confederates want to move up north. Why? If you have the war fought on your own turf, you're going to have civilian deaths and infrastructure basically failing because all this violence and bloodshed is happening on your own land. Okay, so I'll get this in a minute, actually. But another battle that represents how the Confederacy was trying to move north instead of the Union move south was the Battle of Antietam. It happened in Maryland. So Maryland stayed with the Union, and it contained Washington, D.C., so that was beneficial for them. It's considered the bloodiest day in the Civil War, not the bloodiest battle, but the bloodiest single day. The Union claimed a victory, but both sides had heavy losses, and it demonstrated that each side was willing to fight very harshly, and this was not going to be a quick war. Okay? What happens, though, is Lincoln kind of shifts his policy as he goes on. The way he sees it is he does not have the superior leadership in the military, which was true. So he finds every time there's a major battle and the general there fails, he just fires them and replaces them. So generals that got fired, McDowell, McClellan, and he just keeps replacing them until he finds generals that do things that are successful. Because he couldn't rely on experience, he had to rely on performance for that. Now, most of the battles of the Civil War are fought within the area between Washington, D.C., which is just in Maryland, right across the Potomac River, from Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia, which is, if you kind of calculate the distance, it's kind of this no man's land, this buffer zone of about 125 miles. Most battles are fought there, a slow back and forth, okay, without much movement. There's other battles, however, fought further away. So, the war was in the east, mostly in this Virginia, Maryland area. The war in the west was occurring along the Mississippi River. Now, one of the generals that ends up being very successful, eventually so successful that he runs and gets elected twice to the presidency after the Civil War, is Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, now his plan was to move along the Mississippi River and to capture the forts and set them up as military bastions for protecting Union interests. And early into the war, in 1862, only about a year in, the Union captures New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi, very far down in the deep south in Louisiana. Eventually, what this leads to is the Union controlling the Mississippi River, which means that it's difficult for the Confederacy to transport anything. The Union already controlled the Ohio River, the Missouri River. Now they control the Mississippi River. Remember, the South did not have a lot of infrastructure for transportation except for waterways. So the North, the Union controls waterways, railroads, roads, everything. And this is going to impede the South from being successful in their war efforts. While they control the Deep South, the Union military just goes across, especially in Louisiana, and basically enacting abolition and seizing plantations and freeing all the slaves. Okay, so they saw this as a goal to kind of incite rebellion in the idea for freed slaves, for former slaves, for African Americans in the South. And hoping that would cause the ideas to spread among plantations in the area, having this idea of supporting the North over the South. Right. Now, for this whole part of the war, and especially the last slide too, the goal of the Union was to preserve the Union. The stated goal of the war was not to end slavery, not to free all the slaves, but to get the Confederate States to come back and rejoin. That's what Lincoln said. He said, I just don't want slavery to spread, but everyone else can keep their slaves. That's why the border states stayed with the Union, because they said, Lincoln said we get to keep our slaves. Why would we leave? We're going to stay with what's more stable. As the war goes on, I'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in a minute, the goal shifts from preserving the Union to enacting abolition. Okay, one way we see this happen is with this term contraband. It was kind of like a nickname for Southern slaves who had escaped and headed north to join the Union Army. About 200,000 people do this during the Civil War, and they're granted their freedom by Congress. So because they served in the Union military, they were granted their freedom. So it was an incentive, once Southern slaves found out about this, to ditch their plantations and head north so they could get freedom. They could die in the process, of course, but they could gain their freedom in the process, which, of course, the South wasn't willing to give them. All right, now something major. We're going to look at this document in class at some point, the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is critical because it shifts the focus of the war, the goal for the Union, from keeping the Union, getting the Confederate States back, to freeing the slaves. Now, what you have to understand about this is Lincoln was very careful with it. He understood that it was an executive order. In some ways, he understood it was kind of towing the line of what was an abuse of power of the president. But he was also a very strategic military thinker, politician too, and he said, I need to do something that's going to make us more successful than the Confederacy, because the Confederacy was winning most battles. So what he states in here, in the executive order, is that states in slaves that were in states that were in rebellion would be freed, but not in the border states. They got to keep their slaves because he had to make sure those states stayed with the Union in the first place. When we really look at this document, it's not the freeing of all the slaves, or really the freeing of the slaves. It was just a war measure, because he is saying that the slaves in the South got to be freed, but he had absolutely zero power to enforce that, because those were states in rebellion who looked to the Confederate government as their valid government. So really, this document didn't free a single slave, because those that it freed were not in his authority or power to free, and those that it didn't free maintained slavery in the North. Okay? One thing this does, though, is it helps keep Europe neutral. Great Britain and France were favoring a Confederate alliance, even though they were officially neutral. But because the United States of America came out, the Union, I should say, in favor of being more anti-slavery, Britain kind of backed off from any sort of alliance with the Confederates. So Lincoln starts to rethink his goals, going from reunification to abolition. And we're going to see in the next slide how this works of further attempts at enacting abolition, which helped to undermine the Confederacy in the process. Okay, so Lincoln sought to reunify the country, and Lincoln was a very gifted speaker. So he used many speeches to convince people of his ideas and his causes. One of the major ones that is mentioned by name on the left, so we'll have to look at it in class as well, is the Gettysburg Address. So November 19th, 1863. I'll talk about the Battle of Gettysburg on the next slide, but just realize this was given at the dedication of a cemetery for the battle casualties at Gettysburg, because Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Not the bloodiest day, that's Antietam, but the bloodiest battle. But what he does is he approaches this dedication, sort of this invocation at this cemetery, with a new type of language. And it's using the language of redefining the war in terms of our ideals of preserving democracy and freedom, not just preserving the Union. Okay, and that's why this is still such a famous sort of seminal speech today. Is it's short, it's sweet, it gets to the point, but it builds on American ideals in order to convince people of the Union's cause. It's things like the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address that convince a lot of people in the North to support the war cause instead of questioning their involvement, because suddenly the cause had more nobility than just keeping the Union. It was about ideals that everyone held sacred. All right? Within the next year, Lincoln is up for re-election in 1864, and he was running against one of the generals he fired, a Northern Democrat, McClellan. So there was a bit of this old grudge there. Now, Lincoln gets re-elected with a very large electoral majority, but a slim popular majority. Okay, remember, the electoral majority is what matters, but Lincoln looked at this and said, well, just because I won doesn't mean everyone in the North is still really supporting me, just by 5%. Now, something else to notice, and you have the map of this election in the middle there, is that the South isn't voting, right? The Union views the South as in rebellion, so it's not like, we've got to look at it from a different point of view. We're saying, oh, they just didn't show up to vote, so their votes don't count. So it makes Lincoln's victory look even larger. You can see those pie graphs there. The top one is the electoral majority. You can see it's probably 90-something percent, but only a slim popular majority, and all the seceded states are in brown at the bottom, just considered not voting. Okay? And something I'll bring up now, because it's right there, is during the Civil War, 2 more free states, so to speak, join the Union as well. Kansas joins as a free state, which now it can vote as well. It's going to vote for Lincoln. And parts of Virginia that are on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, they wanted to stay with the Union in the first place. So what happens in the middle of the Civil War is there's a decision to break Virginia into Virginia and West Virginia. And West Virginia votes for Lincoln as well. So this was seen as pretty underhanded by the Confederacy, but the way the Union viewed it is, hey, we had a vote in Congress as to whether it should be admitted as a state, and you didn't show up to vote, so what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to wait until the war's over till you come up? So, a little bit underhanded, but mostly constitutional. All right, now, the major thing that enacts abolition is the 13th Amendment. Now, what you have to understand is this happens in 1865, and Lincoln was thinking ahead. I've told you before, he's viewed as a martyr, and that's why he's so popular, but one of the reasons he should be viewed sort of as being such an important president is he was a great politician. He is looking 3 steps ahead. So by 1863, it started to become clear that the Union was probably going to win the war. The South infrastructure is failing, the battles start to go in the North's favor, so Lincoln says, okay, people are taking care of that. I need to consider, what are we going to do about this slavery issue? Because slavery, if slavery isn't gone before the war is over, our problems will not be resolved. The South will still want to keep slavery, and they'll have it as a bargaining chip when we go to the treaty-making table. So what he says is, while the South is gone, let's have Congress amend the Constitution to get rid of slavery entirely. So that means when the South comes back, they don't really have a choice except to accept that it is over. And this has to do with that shifting view of enacting abolition instead of preserving the Union. He said the war could not be won without slavery being gone for good. And so he spends pretty much the last year of his life pushing so hard to get the 13th Amendment pushed through Congress. Now, if you've ever seen the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, I remember when I first went to see the movie and I'm like, oh, it's going to be, a biopic, this biography of Lincoln's life. It's just about that 1 year in his life of trying to get this amendment through Congress. So it's a very focused biography. I think it's really enjoyable. A lot of students think it's kind of boring, but I'm a history teacher. Of course, I'm going to find it enjoyable. Okay. Now what happens is it easily gets through the Senate because they had a large Republican majority. But the House of Representatives still had a sizable portion, a minority, but a sizable portion, of Northern Democrats. And they were pushing back because they said the war's going to be over, and if we're going to have a unified Democratic Party, we don't want to look like traitors to the cause of the South, slavery. So eventually it passes through some wheeling and some dealing. Spielberg's movie does a good job of showing kind of the backroom deals that Lincoln made to get this passed. So he also knew that he got the 13th Amendment through, and he also had to have a Reconstruction plan in place. Okay, so we'll talk about this in the next slideshow with what the different plans were, but he knew that they needed to have a plan there so when the South finally lost and conceded the war was over, they could begin with Reconstruction without having to develop by the seat of their pants. Okay? So, essentially, Southerners would have no choice but to accept those terms and to move forward with the surrender. So Lincoln was very tactical in this way. So, of course, he brought up these lofty ideals of democracy and freedom and, 7 years ago, all that business. But he was very, very calculating as well. Keep that in mind. All right. This is our last slide, having to do with sort of the denouement of the war. Okay, so we got to see where the tides turn and how everything resolves. So, first thing we have to see is that those military victories start turning in favor of the Union. There's two major battles that happen within days of each other in July 1863. In the West, it's the Battle of Vicksburg in Mississippi. That's where Ulysses S. Grant, remember, was trying to take control of the Mississippi River. Basically, by gaining that position, the Confederates no longer have much of a force over there. So they win in the West, and Grant at that point can say, well, let's start moving east to rejoin all our forces to force a Confederate surrender. The other one happened within days of this was in Pennsylvania, in Gettysburg. Now, what happens here, it was kind of a last-ditch effort by the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee was saying, all right, we've been trying so hard to get our military up into the North to force the war to be fought on their turf, which means that their civilians and their infrastructure are going to have losses. So he pushed his army up into there, but this is where we get to the military history that I don't know a lot about and I don't care to know a lot about. Essentially, he was forced to retreat. So, meanwhile, anyway, there's huge losses on both sides. I mentioned this was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. But now what's happening is Lee and his forces are retreating south. You've got Grant and his forces moving east, and then you've got a guy named Sherman in the south starting to move north. Everything is starting to converge and surround Virginia, and there's going to be kind of this stalemate of trying to finally sort of secure a Confederate surrender because it was very slow coming. So interestingly, again, these battles happened within days of each other, but they're thousands of miles apart. Okay, communication was difficult, so don't think that it was that coordinated. Now, one of the reasons for the Union victory was, as it said in the left, improvements in leadership. And the places where Lincoln found this type of leadership was in Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. So basically, they were both known for being capable, they were performing well in battle, but they did so with severe tactics. Now, Grant was essentially willing to take heavy losses in order to achieve victory. And of course, some people dislike that because he wasn't really concerned about the well-being of his soldiers in the process. He's like, a bunch of them can die, but we need to win a victory so we can end the war. Sherman, on the other hand, was famous for a phrase known as war is hell. So when he approached his strategy in the South, he was essentially telling Southerners, you better surrender and move aside because we're going to do whatever we can to make you lose. And he's basically saying that's not just involving military battles with your military, it's going to involve an all-out assault on Southern society. The best thing that's known from this is called the March to the Sea in Georgia. He employed something called the scorched earth policy. So essentially anything in their way, destroying railroads, burning down cities, burning down farms, anything that would devastate the South and try to force them to actually surrender. So Sherman is still very hated in the South today because of this policy. It wasn't, sort of a military policy. It was a policy of devastation, and it affected a lot of civilians. Right? But however, because of Sherman's policy, it helped to lead to the collapse of the South. There was no infrastructure to begin with. Infrastructure that was there was being destroyed by the Union military, and the Union is now converging on a failing Confederacy and sort of bolstered by their new goals and their success in the process. So it was going slow to end the war, but the Union became ever more successful. Meanwhile, Southerners were resisting the draft. They didn't use blacks as a war resource. So this is something that a lot of pro-Confederate people today claim is true, but if you look at the numbers, it just doesn't add up. Okay, we can talk about that in class if you want. They blocked major waterways with the rivers. They, destroyed the railroads. Union was winning the battles. Everything was going in the Union's favor, which means that on April 9th, 1865, in Virginia, in Appomattox, in Virginia, I already said that, Robert E. Lee surrenders unconditionally. So it doesn't mean that this was the last battle, kind of like the same way that the Battle of Yorktown wasn't the last battle of the American Revolution, but it kind of seals the deal that the war is over, the Confederacy surrenders, and we're moving towards Reconstruction at this point. So Interestingly, this is almost 4 years to the day of Fort Sumter. That was April 12th, 1861. So Lincoln's got his 13th Amendment passed. He's basically going through the states to get it approved at this point. He can kind of finally rest and say, we have a plan in place, we can move forward. However, 5 days later, he goes to the theater, and a Southern sympathizer and an actor, John Wilkes Booth, assassinates him while Lincoln and his wife were watching a play. So Booth had been trying to plan an assassination ever since, I think, before Lincoln's second inauguration, so that was about a month before. They even have a picture that shows at Lincoln's inauguration, they can zoom in and say, there's Booth right there. Okay, and he determined that it wasn't a good time to assassinate him because he'd get caught. Right? But this sort of makes Lincoln a martyr dying right as the war is over, but it's also going to have significant ramifications for Reconstruction. Lincoln had his plan, but the question now is his plan going to be enacted with new leadership and a Congress that is much more radical than Lincoln was as a politician himself? I want to leave you in suspense there. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to do your note cards, one for each slide. Get going on that quiz due by 8 a.m. tomorrow, or the due date in case you're watching this early. Work on your geography assignment. It's fun. Don't fight. It's fun. Chronology, geography, make sure to know those for your quiz before the final test. And you can watch our next video on Reconstruction if you want. That is a bit of a doozy. It's 6 slides long, one of the longest we'll ever get to. So just be prepared for that. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you in class. Bye.